Hey, what's up, Bio 1401 class? This is your professor, Dr. DeBrot, and I'm bringing you your first online lecture. So, in this lecture, we'll go over chapter 1.1, and we'll look at specifically the process of science, look at what is biology, and then how do scientists do science? What is science? So, biology is the study of living things. And biology is very broad. It can look at very big things and very small things. So, it goes from the macro, which macro means big, looking at ecology, zoology. Ecology is a study of ecosystems, which is the relationships between living things and their environment. Zoology is a study of animals, and it can go to the very micro, the very small, molecular biology, cell biology. And biology, as uninteresting as it might sound to you right now, it shapes humanity. Understanding biology, understanding living things and how living things work has forever shaped our existence. So take a second and just think of how in your everyday lives you've encountered the power of biology, how biology has shaped and changed your life. So some examples that I want you to be aware of are are the following. So the eradication of cancer, our understanding of biology and cells and mutations have given us has given us the understanding to come up with therapies to treat cancer and to eradicate cancer. It also has given us the tools to fight viruses, and specifically the Ebola virus, which there seems to be a promising vaccine that can prevent Ebola infection and is being used right now and tested in the field in Africa. So obviously, these two examples are health related. So biology has shaped medicine. It's the foundation for medicine, the foundation for healthcare. Biology also is being used to strengthen agricultural crops. So a lot of the food we eat comes to our table thanks to the understanding that biology has given us. So biology helps us understand how what plants need to grow healthy, what animals need to grow healthy, um, and we can optimize how we grow food and make sure that every table has food. Even though that's not the case right now, biology is helping us to grow more food and grow it better. So this is an example. This picture, it's actually a cornfield, but what you might not know is that a lot of this corn is genetically modified, and we'll talk about genetically modified organisms. It's not as kooky as it sounds. It's just genetically modifying this corn in this case to withstand drought and withstand pests so that we can grow more of it to sustain the population. And another cool example of how biology is currently shaping our world is developing alternative biofuels. So this is a picture from a company called Joule that is harvesting algae, green algae in deserts. It's growing them. All you need is water and sunlight because they use photosynthesis to make their food, so you don't need to give them any food. They harvest these algae that they're growing and extract oil from them because a lot of these algae store their food they make as oil. And then you can use this oil to actually as fuel, as biofuel to run cars. So biology is coming up with problems or is being used to solve problems that are facing the world today, such as the fact that a lot of our fuels, our fossil fuels, are running out. So, how do we embrace more alternative fuels, more renewable fuels? And algae, green algae, seems to be a really real solution to this problem. So, where does biology fit in? Science, as you might be aware, is a really broad discipline or broad field. You have everything from mathematics to physics, right, which is still science, all the way to astronomy and sociology and psychology. These are all sciences. So here, this diagram, this figure, from the bottom up, you go from smaller to bigger. So everything from particles, subatomic particles, what the atoms are made of, to the universe and astronomy. And so biology kind of is in the middle there. And biology ties together these more conceptual disciplines like physics and mathematics to real life stuff. Um, Again, healthcare, medicine, sociology, psychology. It kind of is what connects the two. Um, and so biology studies living things, but what is a living thing? What defines life? So how do you know a rock isn't alive? Or a bacteria? How do you know whether they're living organisms or not? And what about a virus? Is that living? And we'll actually I'll ask these questions in class next week and we'll try and answer them together. But as I'm alluding to here, life is surprisingly difficult to pin down. But it can be defined by things that all living things do or have. And here's just a it's not a rigid list, but these are a few things that all living things have, right? So you have to have them all. A high degree of organization. All living things are very complex. All living things require and transform energy. All living things display movement, although not always obvious. All living things reproduce, and most of them grow and develop. All living things maintain their internal environment. This is called homeostasis. All living things respond to stimuli, and all living things adapt and evolve. So let's look at these real quick. Living things are organized. So this is important for you to know, just that there is a organizational hierarchy, or I guess organizational levels to living things. So we start with the most basic units of matter, even though they're smaller things than atoms, but an atom, right? Elements are atoms. When we talk about carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, nitrogen, which you see there in the figure, these are atoms. It is the smallest an element can be, the purest form of an element. So these atoms can come together and bond, and we'll look at this in the next chapter, look at a little chemistry, but they can bond together by different chemical properties to form molecules. And molecules can come together and form macromolecules. So in this case here, we see a DNA double helix, which is a macromolecule. It is a really big molecule. Actually, if you unwind all of the DNA in one of your cells, it is roughly 6 feet long, right? Longer than most of us. And then these macromolecules come together to form organelles, which are little organs of a cell. They're like little rooms or compartments within a cell. And then you have the cell, which is the fundamental unit of life. So really you can say the cell is composed of different organelles, which are made up of different macromolecules, which are made up of molecules, which are made up of atoms, right? So the cell is the fundamental unit of life. So the smallest you can be and still be considered a living thing is a cell. But these cells can come together to form multicellular organisms like you and I. So cells can come together to form tissues, which in turn come together to form organs, which you get a bunch of different organs together to form an organ system. So in this case, you have neurons, neuronal tissue, or neural tissue, which forms an organ, in this case, the brain of this goose. And the brain, along with nerves that run throughout the body of this goose, form an organ system, the nervous system in this case. And you get a bunch of different organ systems together, and you have an organism. Take a sip of my coffee real quick. So here we started with atoms and ended up with an organism. So we're seeing how simple individual components can come together to give rise to new properties, right? Atoms aren't a living thing, but they can come together to form molecules, which can come together to form cells, and those can form multicellular organisms. So these are called emergent properties. Each of the levels we looked at has emergent properties. And they're properties that result from the interaction of these individual components. So life itself is an emergent property. Life is a property that emerges out of the interaction of simple components, individual components. So you have molecules that can come together to form macromolecules, a phospholipid in this case, and phospholipids come together to form the skin of the cell, the outer surface of the cell called a lipid bilayer, the cell membrane. And this cell membrane, along with other components, are what make up a cell. And I told you guys the smallest you can be and still be a living thing is a cell. So this single celled organism here, called a paramecium, the fact that it's alive, that is an emergent property, right? Life is a property that emerges out of the interaction of simpler components. All right, so we just saw that all living things are organized. They're all very complex. And all living things also require energy. So here we have a figure of the food web, in this case the soil food web, and all the energy that is required for living things ultimately comes from the sun. So you have the sun, which is really just a ball of hot energy, and plants capture that energy, turn that into sugar, which is essentially what the herbivores, the primary consumers, how they get their energy is from plants that are making their energy out of the sun. And then all the other organisms eat each other and form this complex web. So energy flows from the sun through these organisms ultimately to the top of the food chain, which are humans currently. We are the top of the food chain on this earth. So all living things also display movement. Very intuitive. Most things that you see moving around, you're like, oh, those are living things, right? But movement isn't always obvious. So there's examples of organisms like diatoms, lithops, and this living rock, which are living things, but you can't really see them move if you just look at them. So diatoms are these microscopic organisms. They're kind of like a silicon crystal, really. They have this capsule made out of silicon, and you can't really see them move, but there's stuff happening inside it that we can't see with our naked eye. Lithops are these little cacti that look like rocks, and you look at them, they're camouflage. You can't really see them move if you stare at them for 5 minutes, but if you do like a time lapse over several days, you can see that they move. They just are doing it very slowly. And then the living rock, this is a marine organism, Pichilensis, which if you were to look at it in the ocean, it just looks like a rock, but it's a living thing. Inside, it's actually doing stuff, using energy, doing a lot of the things which we're going to learn about in this class. So it's made up of cells that are constantly dividing and replicating DNA and making proteins. So there's movement that might not be obvious to us, but all living things display movement. And all living things reproduce, right? All living things have to reproduce because things die eventually. So you need to be able to raise up the next generation. And most organisms grow and develop. Not all. So a bacteria divides, it reproduces, but it's not going to grow and it's not going to develop like we develop, right? We develop from a single cell to a fetus to a baby to an adult. A bacteria just divides once and boom, there you go. You have another bacteria. So, but all living things reproduce. And reproduction can be either asexual, which means there's no sex, or sexual. Offspring of asexually reproducing organisms are identical to their single parent. So an asexually reproducing organism like a bacteria, or in this case, a strawberry plant, you have one parent that simply gives rise to offspring. So this strawberry plant normally reproduces sexually, but sometimes can reproduce asexually. So you can see that it has these little roots that have little plantlets. Each of those plantlets is genetically identical to the parent, right? It only has one parent. One plant is giving rise to these other plants. And asexual reproduction is a very successful strategy in unchanging environments because you can make a lot of yourself, basically copy yourself, clone yourself. Asexual reproduction is basically cloning. You can just clone yourself and reproduce yourself. And if the environment doesn't change, you're going to be successful. There's going to be thousands of you that are going to be successful. But if the environment changes, say the strawberry plant, all of a sudden there's a drought and this plant is sensitive to drought, if the environment changes, this parent plant and all of its offspring are going to die. So if the environment is changing, and is which most environments are, then asexual reproduction is not the way to go. So offspring of sexually reproducing organisms are better equipped to handle change because they receive genetic material from two parents. And most things we consider living things reproduce sexually. And in this picture, the two young swans receive the genetic material from two parents. So they're not just an exact copy of one parent, they are a mix of the two parents. And this mix, this diversity, might actually help them survive some change in the environment that their parents might be sensitive to. So, sexual reproduction is very successful in changing environments, which is why most living things reproduce sexually. All right, living things also maintain their internal environment. So this might be new to you, but all living things are constantly regulating or controlling their internal environment. And this is called homeostasis. It's the process by which a cell or a multicellular organism maintains equilibrium. Homeo means same, stasis is to stay, so to stay the same. So your body and living things in general kind of function like a thermostat. The thermostat and a heating or cooling unit. So for example, you want to maintain comfortable room temperature, which in our house is a little hot. We kind of like it a little hotter than most at 78 degrees. But say you want to keep it at that. So once the room starts getting too warm, your thermostat's going to sense that and it's going to turn the heater off or the cooler on, right? The AC on, and it cools the room till you go back to that comfortable temperature. Maybe in the winter it gets too cold, and so the thermostat's going to sense that and turn on the heater so that you can go back to that comfortable room temperature. And it's constantly trying to maintain it, right? It's constantly turning on and off, on and off, on and off. This is what your body does. We humans have an internal thermostat that helps maintain temperature. So in the figure here, in the left, you have a woman that is too cold, and so she shivers. The reason you shiver, it's a natural response of the body to cold temperatures. It's so that you use up energy, and when you use energy, you create heat. So when you shiver, your whole body shivers. You're actually heating up your body. On the flip side, if your body gets too hot, so if you're exercising like the woman on the right, you're using energy, and if you use energy, you release heat, so your body heats up. And your body it senses that you're getting too hot, and it kicks on its AC unit, which is sweat. And so when your body sweats, when water evaporates off of your skin, it actually is wicking away, pulling away heat. So it is a way of getting rid of the excess heat in your body. And homeostasis isn't just about temperature. Even the simplest organisms like bacteria are trying to regulate the concentration of nutrients, salts, and water, and pH in their internal environment. So a bacteria inside the cell, they're trying to maintain a specific pH or salt concentration, which we'll learn about. So all living things are trying to maintain their internal environment. And all living things respond to stimuli. So you have plants that are responding to sunlight and grow in the direction of the most sunlight. You have even plants that respond to physical stimulus like the Venus flytrap, which can sense when there is an insect in the trap and can respond to that. And all living things adapt and evolve. Um, so here you see a little pygmy seahorse that is perfectly blended into the coral habitat where it lives, and it's uncanny, right? It has the same little knobs and features that the coral ridge has. And coral is another example of something that's living but doesn't really move too much. And you might not have known actually that coral is a living organism until right now, but it is. But this pygmy seahorse is perfectly adapted to its environment. And the seahorses that will blend in the best in this specific coral reef are the most likely to survive and the most likely to pass on their genes to the next generation. So all living things do this. All living things are adapting to their environment so that they can pass on their genes to the next generation. Even simple organisms like bacteria are adapting. And adaptation, we'll learn about this when we look at evolution, really is all about genetic diversity, accumulating mutations. And so in this population of bacteria, one of the bacteria has accumulated a mutation just by random chance. And this is not going to be really helpful. Say this mutation makes the bacteria resistant to antibiotics. So this mutation isn't going to be really helpful unless there's an antibiotic. So as soon as this population faces an antibiotic, that the bacteria with that mutation is going to reproduce more than the other green bacteria without the mutation. And now this bacteria has adapted to its environment that in this case has antibiotic present. All right, so living things display all of these characteristics, not just some of them. For example, we talked about all living things display movement. Well, we know there are things that move that aren't alive, right? For example, these are sailing stones of Death Valley. There are these stones that over months move on their own. No one else is moving them. There's no one around, but they leave these trails, kind of like they're sailing along this desert. And it wasn't until last year that we figured out how this happened. It was really cool, but in the desert, it gets really cold, and ice was forming on the surface of the desert, and these stones were slowly gliding along the ice, very slowly, over months and months and months. Eventually, they left these trails. But clearly, stones aren't living things, but these stones, in this example, are moving. But they're not using energy, they're not responding to stimuli, they're not reproducing. So it doesn't display all of the characteristics, therefore it's not a living thing. Another example, there's these stones in Eastern Europe called trovantes, which seem to reproduce. You can see the boulder here giving rise to new boulders. And it's almost like the stone is reproducing, but again, it's not responding to stimulus, it's not using energy, it's not, or in this case, it is reproducing, but it's not adapting or evolving, so it's not a living thing. And there are theories as to why this happens, but I don't think it's fully known yet exactly what's going on here. But that's the cool thing about science, is that we can make guesses as to what's going on and then do experiments to see if our guesses are right or not. So this is the process of science, and let's step into that, into the scientific method and what is science. So let's begin with the nature of science. These are a couple of quotes by really prominent scientists, Nobel-winning scientists, or at least Richard Feynman is. So he says, if you thought that science was certain, well, that is just an error on your part. So what he's alluding to is the fact that science, it's not about making truth claims. Science isn't in the business of proving things, right? When you hear in the news, science just proved, well, that's not exactly what science does. It's not interested in proving things. It's just interested in explaining something. And it might be right, it might be wrong, time will tell, but all that science is interested in is explaining what we see in the world around us. Another quote, in science, we never have sufficient reason for the belief that we have attained the truth. This is Sir Karl Popper, another very notable philosopher of science. Um, Again, same idea, right? Science isn't in the business of proving things. It's in the business of giving probable models or probable explanations for what we see in the world. So, kind of the flow of these models is a hypothesis, which is, we'll talk about in a second. It's like a probable answer to a question. And over time, if that's shown to be true again and again and again, that becomes a theory, which eventually can become a law if it's just universally shown to apply to all all circumstances and instances. It's kind of like a universal theory. So these are all models, all different stages of models to explain reality. And Darwin here is a picture of Charles Darwin, which we'll look at the end of the course, who was the one who came up with the hypothesis of evolution by natural selection, which has now over time become a scientific theory, which isn't the same as our idea of a theory. It's something shown to be true or shown to be correct, I guess. It's basically supported by evidence over long periods of time. So science is not primarily a body of knowledge. Obviously, science does consist of a lot of things we already know. Your textbook, right, has it compiles a bunch of what we know about biology since the very beginnings of biology. But that's not primarily what science is. Science is a process of discovery. So I want you guys to burn that into your brain. Science isn't a collection of facts, it's a process. And it's a discipline of observation, inquiry, inference, and testing. So let's break a few of those down. Observation is just observing, looking. Inquiry is making questions. Inference is inferring probable answers. So taking what you know and making a hypothesis or giving a educated guess as to what's going on. And then you test that guess to see if it's correct or not. And we humans have done this for millennia using two things, deductive inference and inductive inference. So for millennia, we've been doing science, even before science was formally known as science, using these two things. And specifically, we use the scientific method, which is here on the right. All right, so let's break down deductive reasoning and inductive reasoning. Deduction is making definitive conclusions or answers, giving definitive answers based on what's known. And it normally flows from general to specific. So for example, mammals are warm-blooded, marsupials are warm-blooded, therefore marsupials are mammals. So you just went from general observations to a specific claim that marsupials are mammals. And you're making a definitive conclusion. You're like, this is what it is. Another example, all men are mortal. Chuck Norris is a man, therefore Chuck Norris is mortal. Right? So you're going from general to specific and you're making a definitive claim, giving a definitive answer. All right, so how's that different from induction? Induction is coming up with possible, not definitive, very important, possible conclusions or answers based on what's known. And it normally flows from specific to general. So let's look at how this differs from deductive inference. So here you have mice are warm-blooded animals, marsupials are warm-blooded animals, therefore all mammals are possibly warm-blooded. So you're going from specific to general. And the beauty of this is you're giving a possible answer, not a definitive one. So then you test it and you see whether your educated guess or probable answer, which is really a hypothesis, is correct or not. All right, and let's look at our second example and contrasting it from deduction. All men are mortal. Chuck Norris is a man. Therefore, Chuck Norris is possibly mortal. So here we're not going from specific to general, but the thing here, the main difference is that you're not giving a definitive answer. You're giving a possible answer, a possible conclusion. And then you The beauty is that you set yourself up for testing and experimentation. So then we test it. And we'll watch a funny video next week about how we test whether Chuck Norris is immortal or not, where we're testing this hypothesis. Is this hypothesis right? Is Chuck Norris mortal or not? And here's Chuck Norris reminding you that science is mainly a discipline of inference. And we use both deductive inference and inductive inference. All right, so most science today progresses through inference by using the scientific method. And here again is a scientific method on the right. And it can vary, but the general framework is always the same. So it's not like a rigid set of steps. Actually, if you look at different textbooks, these steps might be different, but the general framework is the same. And central to the scientific method is the hypothesis, which is a probable answer to your question. So hypothesis must be testable. It must be falsifiable. So you must be able to test it, right? You have to be able to come up with some sort of experiment to test whether it's right or wrong. And it must be falsifiable. So it has to be an idea that you can prove wrong. So for example, a lot of people ask, well, can science prove whether God exists or not? And some people say, yeah, it can, but there is no way to falsify. There's no way to prove that God doesn't exist, right? There's no way to, if your hypothesis is God exists, there's no way to really prove that he doesn't exist. So that's not a scientific question. It's not a scientific hypothesis, right? A scientific hypothesis must be falsifiable. And this one's interesting. A hypothesis cannot be proven right. It can only be supported by experimentation. So let's go through the figure on the right, and I'll explain that. So the scientific method starts with observation, looking around, again, being curious, opening your eyes to the world around you. And that's going to lead to a question. And then you're going to give a probable answer to your question, a hypothesis. This hypothesis doesn't have to be right. You can come up with any kind of possible answer, whatever you want, because the beauty is that then we're going to test it. So you come up with your hypothesis and then you make a prediction. So if this is right, then we should be able to see this, right? And so that's kind of setting you up for an experiment or a test. So you test your hypothesis, and that test, you analyze the results, and those results are either going to support or not support the hypothesis. So if it supports the hypothesis, say the test, you made your prediction and you made your prediction using the hypothesis and the prediction was right, then you make additional predictions to support your hypothesis, right? So you don't only test a hypothesis one way. Ideally, you're testing it many, many, many different ways. So you have a lot of evidence that that hypothesis is right. But if you analyze your results of the test and the results do not support the hypothesis, then you scratch your original hypothesis and you devise a new one. So that's the beauty of science is you're coming up with all these possible explanations and just ruling out the ones that are incorrect, and you come up with evidence that supports the ones that are correct. And the ones that are correct, if they are correct long enough, they'll become a theory. But hypotheses can't be proven right. So even if you have an experiment that shows your hypothesis was correct, it doesn't mean that it's true or that it's right. It's supported by the experiment, but doesn't mean it's right, because there could be other explanations that we just aren't aware of. But over time, if a hypothesis is after much testing and validation and multiple independent scientists show that or have evidence that support this hypothesis, a hypothesis can become a theory. So a theory is a model that explains how something works. And it has a high degree of probability, but it's never 100% certain. So in science, you can't say, for example, the theory of evolution is 100% certain. This is exactly how it goes, right? It's just a model that so far has been useful to explain a lot of the observations we see in the living world, namely the diversity that we see in the living world. And just very important, even like solid scientists don't pick up on this or get this wrong, but a scientific theory is not what you mean or what you and I mean when we say, oh, my theory is that blah blah blah, right? There you're basically using the word theory in a way that's analogous to an idea. My idea on this is. But a scientific theory is not just an idea someone had. The theory of evolution is not just, oh yeah, this is my take on the evidence. This is my idea on the evidence. It's a hypothesis that has stood the test of time and that is supported by many, many pieces of evidence. And something important about the scientific method is that you do it all the time, every day. You're all scientists, you just don't even know it. Um, so, for example, an everyday example of this, of you doing the scientific method, would be there's a blackout, you grab your flashlight, and it doesn't work. So that's your observation. You're naturally going to start asking questions on why it doesn't work. What's wrong with the flashlight? And you're naturally going to come up with hypotheses, different hypotheses. One might be that the batteries are dead. And so then you make a prediction. If the batteries are dead and you replace them with new ones, the flashlight will work. And so you do it, you test it, you replace it. If the results of that experiment support your hypothesis, so if the flashlight turns on, if your prediction turns out to be right, then you make other predictions based off of that hypothesis, right? In this case, there aren't many others you could do, but in science you would. But if the results of your experiment don't support the hypothesis, so you replace the batteries with new ones and the flashlight is still dead, you scratch your original hypothesis that the batteries are dead. That's not right. That is, now you have, what you can do is scratch a hypothesis, falsify a hypothesis, show that that hypothesis is wrong. So then you come up with a new hypothesis, which, for example, would be maybe the bulb is burnt out. So then your prediction would be if you replace the bulb with a new one, the flashlight should work, right? And if that's right, if that's wrong, you scratch that hypothesis and you come up with a new one. So you do this all the time. You do this when you cook, when something doesn't go right after you cook, when the meal turns out horrible, you start asking what went wrong, or you have car troubles. Anyway, whatever example you can come up with, you do the scientific method all the time. Just isn't formal. In real life, in practice, in the scientific community, the scientific method looks more like this. So you have an observation, a question, and you come up with multiple hypotheses that you test with an experiment, and that experiment can rule out different hypotheses. So you stick with the ones that work. You come up with another experiment to try and rule out the other hypotheses, because these are different hypotheses, and eventually you remain with a solid hypothesis. You make predictions. You do multiple experiments to try and invalidate that hypothesis and say that most of your experiments 1, 2, and 3 support your or confirm your predictions, which support your hypothesis. But if there's one experiment that doesn't support it, then you have to modify it or scratch it or come up with a new one, right? So I don't expect you guys to know this and this process to this level of detail, but this is just to show you that the scientific method is way more complicated than it looks in practice, in the real world, in the scientific world. So yeah, now that we've learned what the scientific method is, what hypotheses are, and on Tuesday we'll learn about how we go about testing these hypotheses and how science works, the process of science. So I hope you enjoyed this first lecture. This is going to be on YouTube all semester long, so if you need to refer back to this, you're welcome to do it. Um, there's not going to be homework based off of this lecture, nor any of the other ones that we do. But these lectures are important so that on Tuesday you can know what's going on, because we're going to go further and deeper on with chapter one. And if you don't watch the Thursday lectures, you're going to be completely lost on Tuesday. And so on Tuesday, I'm going to assign homework, and I'm going to expect you to be able to complete that homework. And that homework is going to be based both off of the Tuesday lecture and this online lecture. All right, so hopefully you enjoyed it. I'm going to try and keep these to a little bit shorter than 30 minutes. So I apologize for going over a little bit. And hope you have a great weekend. Remember to turn in your questionnaire, do that first assignment on mastering biology that guides you through how our online homework works. And if you have any questions whatsoever, bug me, please. A lot of you have already emailed me, and I've tried my best to email you within the same day, if not hours. Um, so feel free to bug me as much as you want. All right, guys. Look forward to the rest of the semester, to our class on Tuesday. Adios.